The year is 1187. The morning sun cast long shadows across the horns of Hattin, and Saladin, Salah ad-Din, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, stood motionless on the ridge, his weathered hands resting on his sword hilt. Below him, the largest Crusader army ever assembled in the Holy Land lay trapped, their banners wilting in the merciless July heat. For decades, these knights had ruled Jerusalem with iron fists, their conquest built on the blood of Muslim civilians. Now, at this pivotal moment, the fate of the Holy City rested in his hands. But this was not a man driven by vengeance. This was a leader who had spent his life learning that true power lay not in the sword, but in the choices that define a soul. How had a Kurdish boy from Tikrit risen to unite a fractured Muslim world? How had he transformed himself from a reluctant soldier into Islam's greatest champion? The answer lies not in his victories, but in the moments when he chose mercy over might, unity over division, and faith over fear. In the mid-12th century, when Saladin was born around 1137, the Muslim world was a patchwork of rivalries. Sunni fought Shiite, Arab competed with Turk, and local emirs prioritized personal gain over collective strength. Into this fractured landscape came Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a Kurdish youth whose family had fled the mountains of Armenia to serve as soldiers and administrators in the courts of Syria and Egypt. Being Kurdish in an Arab-dominated world meant perpetual outsider status. Saladin understood from childhood what it meant to prove himself daily, to earn respect through competence rather than inherit it through bloodline. This experience of otherness would later fuel his extraordinary ability to unite diverse peoples under a single banner. He learned early that leadership meant building bridges, not walls. His father, Ayyub, and uncle, Shirkuh, served the powerful Nur ad-Din, ruler of Damascus and Aleppo. These men were not mere court functionaries, but seasoned warriors who had dedicated their lives to jihad, the struggle to reclaim Muslim lands from Crusader occupation. Young Saladin absorbed their dedication while developing his own distinct character. Where they saw conquest, he increasingly saw the need for justice. Where they pursued military objectives, he contemplated the moral weight of leadership. The defining transformation of Saladin's character began in Egypt, where he accompanied his uncle Shirkuh on campaigns to support the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate. Here was a realm where Sunni and Shiite Islam coexisted uneasily, where political intrigue flowed like the Nile itself, and where a young Kurdish officer would learn the most crucial lesson of his life, that true authority comes not from force, but from moral legitimacy. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, leaving Saladin as vizier to the Fatimid Caliph, many expected the young Kurd to be a mere puppet. Instead, he displayed remarkable political acumen, slowly consolidating power while respecting the complex religious and ethnic tapestry of Egypt. He did not rule through fear or purges. Instead, he earned loyalty by demonstrating that he governed for the welfare of all subjects, not just his Kurdish inner circle. The most revealing moment came when he faced the choice of how to handle the Fatimid establishment. These were Shiite Muslims who had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, yet Saladin himself was Sunni. Military logic suggested violent suppression. Instead, he chose gradual transition, allowing many Fatimid officials to retain positions based on competence rather than religious affiliation. This decision revealed the moral compass that would guide his entire career, the belief that unity required inclusion, not elimination. Throughout these formative years, Saladin remained nominally subordinate to Nur ad-Din in Damascus. Their relationship was complex: mentor and student, idealist and pragmatist, visionary and implementer. Nur ad-Din dreamed of a unified Muslim response to the Crusades, but his methods often relied on political maneuvering and military pressure. Saladin absorbed his mentor's strategic thinking while developing his own approach to leadership. The tension between them grew as Saladin's reputation flourished. Nur ad-Din began to suspect that his Kurdish protege harbored independent ambitions, while Saladin struggled with the moral complexity of maintaining loyalty to a mentor whose methods increasingly troubled him. When Nur ad-Din died unexpectedly in 1174, Saladin faced the defining choice of his career. Would he respect the succession of Nur ad-Din's young son, or would he pursue his own vision of Muslim unity? His decision to gradually assert control over Syria while maintaining the fiction of serving the legitimate heir revealed both his political sophistication and his moral struggle. He genuinely believed that unity under his leadership would serve Islam better than fragmented rule under a weak successor. Yet he also recognized the ethical ambiguity of his position. This internal conflict between personal ambition and religious duty would haunt him throughout his rise to power. Uniting the Muslim world proved far more challenging than conquering it. Saladin spent years campaigning not just against Crusader strongholds, but against fellow Muslims who preferred local autonomy to centralized rule. He fought the Zengids of Mosul, negotiated with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and gradually absorbed the smaller emirates of Syria and Mesopotamia. Each victory came with moral complexity. When he besieged Damascus in 1174, he was attacking the city where he had learned statecraft. When he moved against Aleppo, he was subduing fellow Muslims who had their own legitimate claims to independence. These campaigns revealed the painful truth that even righteous causes require morally ambiguous actions. Yet throughout these struggles, Saladin demonstrated the qualities that would define his legacy. He consistently offered generous terms to defeated enemies, incorporated former rivals into his administration, and showed particular concern for the welfare of civilian populations. His treatment of captured Muslim rivals stood in stark contrast to the brutal internecine warfare common in his era. He understood that lasting unity required not just military victory, but reconciliation and healing. By 1183, Saladin controlled an empire stretching from Egypt to Iraq, from Yemen to southeastern Turkey. Yet his greatest achievement was not territorial, but moral. He had transformed himself from a reluctant soldier into a leader who embodied Islamic ideals of justice, mercy, and protection of the innocent. His court became known throughout the Muslim world for its accessibility, its meritocratic appointments, and its commitment to religious scholarship and charitable works. This moral transformation was deeply personal. Contemporary accounts describe his increasing devotion to prayer, his consultations with religious scholars, and his growing sense of divine mission. He began to see himself not merely as a political leader, but as an instrument of divine will tasked with restoring Muslim dignity and reclaiming the Holy Land. This spiritual dimension of his character would prove crucial in the trials ahead. The man who had once served reluctantly in his uncle's army had become someone who prayed before every major decision, who consulted extensively with religious authorities, and who genuinely believed that his success depended on moral righteousness rather than military might. This was not mere political calculation. It was a profound transformation of identity that would define every choice he made in the climactic struggle for Jerusalem. As reports reached him of Crusader atrocities, of pilgrims prevented from reaching holy sites, of Muslim civilians living under foreign occupation, Saladin felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. The scattered Kurdish boy had become the unified Muslim world's greatest hope. But hope, he had learned, was not enough. The reclamation of Jerusalem would require not just military brilliance, but moral courage that could inspire a civilization and command the grudging respect of enemies. The stage was set for the greatest test of his life, where all his lessons in leadership, mercy, and moral conviction would face the ultimate trial. The boy who had learned to navigate between worlds would now have to reshape the world itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the bustle of Damascus slept and only the muezzin's call echoed through the stone corridors, Saladin found himself alone with the weight of history. The year was 1186, and the Sultan of Syria and Egypt had achieved everything his mentor Nur ad-Din had dreamed of. Yet the greatest prize remained beyond reach. Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, the destination of the Prophet's night journey, still flew the banner of the Crusader kingdom. For nearly 9 decades since that terrible day in 1099, when Crusader armies had stormed the city and slaughtered its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, the Al-Aqsa Mosque had been converted into a royal palace. The Dome of the Rock had housed Christian knights, and Muslim pilgrims had been forbidden from approaching their sacred sites. Every prayer, every dawn reflection, every moment of contemplation reminded Saladin that his greatest duty remained unfulfilled. But this was not the burning desire for conquest that had driven earlier Muslim leaders. This was something deeper, a spiritual calling that had grown within him as he had matured, from warrior to ruler to moral leader. The man who had learned to unite diverse peoples, to show mercy to enemies, to choose justice over vengeance, now faced the ultimate test of his character. How could he reclaim Jerusalem without becoming the very thing he had spent his life opposing? The reports from his spies painted a troubling picture. The Crusader states were weakening, divided by internal conflicts and poor leadership. King Guy of Lusignan was widely considered incompetent, while the Knights Templar and Hospitallers pursued their own violent agendas. The opportunity for military victory had perhaps never been greater. Yet Saladin found himself haunted by the precedent of 1099. When the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, they had justified massive civilian slaughter as divine will. They had claimed that God demanded the blood of infidels. Now, as he prepared his own campaign, Saladin faced the question that would define his legacy. Would he respond to brutality with brutality? Or would he demonstrate that Islamic conquest could be different? In his private chambers, surrounded by the theological works of Al-Ghazali and the chronicles of earlier Muslim conquests, Saladin wrestled with this moral complexity. His advisors spoke of vengeance, of eye-for-eye justice, of the need to demonstrate strength through terror. But his own evolving understanding of leadership, shaped by years of navigating between mercy and authority, pointed toward a different path. Those who knew Saladin best, his biographer Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, his brother al-Adil, his closest advisors, noticed a change in him during these months of preparation. His prayers became longer and more intense. His consultations with religious scholars increased. He began to speak less of military strategy and more of moral responsibility. The Kurdish outsider who had learned to unite a fractured world now confronted the ultimate question of unity. Could Islamic civilization demonstrate that it was capable of conquest without massacre, of victory without vengeance, of strength without cruelty? The answer, Saladin realized, lay not in the actions of his armies, but in the choices he would make in the moments of triumph. He began to prepare not just for military campaign, but for moral test. He issued instructions to his commanders about the treatment of civilians, the protection of religious sites, and the importance of discipline even in victory. He spoke to his men about the difference between jihad as struggle for justice and jihad as excuse for brutality. Most importantly, he made a private vow that would guide every decision in the trials ahead. In the solitude of his chamber, in the sacred hours before dawn, Saladin made a commitment that would echo through history. He would reclaim Jerusalem not through the methods of 1099, but through the principles he had spent his life developing. He would demonstrate that Islamic conquest could be an act of liberation rather than destruction, that victory could be achieved without abandoning the moral values that made victory meaningful. This was not mere political calculation. This was a spiritual transformation that connected his personal journey of growth to the broader destiny of his civilization. The Kurdish boy who had learned to navigate between worlds would now attempt to reshape the very nature of religious war itself. As he prepared for the campaign that would define his legacy, Saladin carried with him not just the hopes of the Muslim world, but the weight of proving that power and principle could coexist, that military might could serve moral ends, and that even in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, there remained space for mercy, justice, and human dignity. The Battle of Hattin awaited. Jerusalem lay beyond. And the man who had transformed himself from reluctant soldier to spiritual leader would now discover whether his vision of moral conquest could survive the ultimate test of war. The summer of 1187 brought Saladin his greatest opportunity and his greatest test. As the Crusader army of nearly 20,000 men marched across the barren hills of Galilee, desperately seeking water under the merciless July sun, Saladin watched from the heights above. This was the moment toward which his entire life had been building. Not just the military triumph, but the moral choice that would define his legacy. His tactical brilliance had drawn the Crusaders into an impossible position. By threatening Tiberias, he had forced them to march across waterless terrain in the height of summer, while his own forces controlled every source of water. The Christian army, weighed down by heavy armor and driven by panic, stumbled toward the twin peaks called the Horns of Hattin like sheep to slaughter. But as victory approached, Saladin faced the defining moment of his character. His men expected vengeance for decades of Crusader brutality. Islamic law provided precedent for executing captured enemies. Military logic suggested that eliminating the Crusader leadership would end the threat forever. Yet the man who had spent his life learning to choose mercy over might, unity over division, stood at the crossroads between two kinds of conquest. When the Crusader army finally collapsed on July 4, 1187, the scene was devastating. Knights lay prostrate in the dust, their armor cooking them in the heat. King Guy of Lusignan, the incompetent ruler whose poor decisions had led to this catastrophe, was captured, along with nearly every significant Crusader leader. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, had fallen into Muslim hands. Saladin's tent became the stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of moral leadership. When the defeated King Guy was brought before him, parched and desperate, Saladin personally offered him water, a gesture of humanity that shocked both sides. In the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, such mercy toward an enemy leader was almost unprecedented. But the real test came with the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, the military orders whose members had made careers of killing Muslims. These men expected no mercy, and by the standards of their time, deserved none. Their entire existence was dedicated to holy war against Islam. Yet, as Saladin looked upon these defeated enemies, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate the difference between Islamic conquest and Christian brutality. His decision was characteristically complex. He ordered the execution of the Templar and Hospitaller leadership, men who had refused to convert and would certainly return to warfare if released. But he spared the ordinary knights, the infantry, and all who expressed willingness to abandon their crusading vows. This was not arbitrary cruelty, but calculated mercy, designed to eliminate the most dangerous enemies, while offering redemption to those willing to accept it. The victory at Hattin opened the path to Jerusalem, but it also intensified the moral pressure on Saladin. As city after city surrendered, Acre, Ascalon, Gaza, Beirut, the Muslim world's expectations grew. They had waited nearly a century for this moment. They wanted the blood of their oppressors. They wanted vengeance for 1099. Yet Saladin's approach to conquest revealed the depth of his transformation. Rather than storming each city with overwhelming force, he consistently offered generous terms of surrender. Garrisons were allowed to leave with their weapons and possessions. Christian civilians were protected from harm. Churches were converted to mosques, but without the wholesale destruction that had characterized earlier conquests. This strategy was not just morally motivated, but strategically brilliant. By demonstrating that surrender brought mercy rather than massacre, Saladin encouraged rapid capitulation. Cities that might have resisted for months surrendered within days. The Crusader state collapsed, not through terror, but through the recognition that Islamic rule offered better protection than Christian defense. When Saladin's army finally appeared before the walls of Jerusalem in September 1187, the city's defenders knew their situation was hopeless. The Crusader army had been destroyed at Hattin. No relief force was coming. The Muslim world's greatest leader stood at the gates with an overwhelming advantage. Yet what followed was perhaps the most remarkable siege in medieval history. Rather than assault the walls immediately, Saladin opened negotiations. He offered the city's inhabitants the same terms he had provided elsewhere: safe passage, protection of property, and freedom to continue their religious practices under Islamic rule. The Christian leaders, led by Balian of Ibelin, initially refused. They threatened to destroy the city's Islamic holy sites and massacre its Muslim population if Saladin attacked. This was precisely the kind of moral blackmail that had characterized Crusader rule: the use of innocent lives as shields for political objectives. Saladin's response revealed the full measure of his moral evolution. Rather than call their bluff or respond with equal threats, he patiently continued negotiations. He understood that the true test of his character lay not in how he treated defeated enemies, but in how he protected innocent civilians. The Kurdish outsider who had learned to unite diverse peoples now faced the ultimate challenge of protecting those who had no voice in the decisions of kings and sultans. On October 2, 1187, after brief negotiations, Jerusalem surrendered. The moment that followed would define Saladin's legacy more than any military victory. As his forces entered the city, they found not a scene of massacre, but of protection. Saladin had issued strict orders: no harm to civilians, no looting of property, no desecration of Christian holy sites. The contrast with 1099 was deliberate and profound. Where the Crusaders had waded through blood, Saladin's men maintained discipline. Where Christian conquerors had slaughtered Muslim civilians, Islamic forces protected Christian inhabitants. Where the Crusader conquest had been marked by 3 days of massacre, the Islamic reconquest was characterized by 3 days of organized, merciful evacuation. This was not mere political theater. Saladin personally supervised the protection of Christian pilgrims, allowed families to ransom captured relatives, and even provided financial assistance to those too poor to pay the standard liberation fee. When his advisors complained about his generosity, he replied that his reputation was worth more than any ransom gold. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Saladin's character was revealed in his treatment of former enemies who chose to remain under Islamic rule. Rather than viewing Christian inhabitants as perpetual threats, he recognized that lasting peace required integration rather than elimination. Christian merchants continued to trade, Christian pilgrims continued to visit holy sites, and Christian scholars continued to contribute to intellectual life. This policy of inclusion extended even to former Crusader leaders. When Richard the Lionheart arrived during the Third Crusade, he found himself facing not a typical medieval warlord, but a sophisticated leader who combined military brilliance with diplomatic finesse. Their relationship, marked by mutual respect despite bitter warfare, demonstrated Saladin's ability to separate personal honor from political conflict. The famous exchanges between Saladin and Richard, gifts of fruit during truces, medical assistance during illness, expressions of admiration despite enmity, revealed the kind of leader Saladin had become. He had learned that true strength lay not in humiliating enemies, but in earning their respect, not in inspiring fear, but in commanding admiration. As the Third Crusade ground on, Saladin faced his most difficult challenge yet. The arrival of European reinforcements under Richard and Philip Augustus of France meant that his reconquest was incomplete. The Christian forces proved more resilient than expected, and the campaign became a test of endurance rather than decisive victory. Yet even in this prolonged struggle, Saladin's character remained consistent. He continued to honor truces, protect civilians, and treat prisoners with dignity. When his own forces committed atrocities, he punished them. When opportunities arose for excessive revenge, he chose restraint. The man who had learned to balance power with principle now demonstrated that these lessons could survive even the most challenging circumstances. When Saladin died in Damascus in 1193, he left behind more than a military legacy. He had demonstrated that Islamic conquest could be different from Christian brutality, that political power could serve moral ends, and that even in the harsh realities of medieval warfare, there remained space for mercy, justice, and human dignity. His impact transcended religious boundaries. Christian chroniclers wrote of his honor with admiration. Jewish communities remembered his protection with gratitude. Muslim historians celebrated not just his victories, but his character. He had become that rarest of historical figures, a leader respected by all sides of the conflicts he had navigated. The Kurdish boy who had learned to survive as an outsider had become the Islamic world's greatest champion. The reluctant soldier who had served others' ambitions had forged his own destiny. The pragmatic politician who had mastered the art of power had never forgotten the importance of principle. But perhaps Saladin's greatest achievement was proving that individual moral choice could reshape historical destiny. At every crucial moment, from his rise in Egypt to his mercy at Jerusalem, he had chosen the difficult path of justice over the easy path of expedience. These choices, repeated across a lifetime, had transformed not just his own character, but the very nature of Islamic leadership. In an age when might made right, when religious war seemed to justify any brutality, when the logic of conquest demanded the elimination of enemies, Saladin demonstrated that there was another way. He showed that true strength lay not in inspiring fear, but in commanding respect, not in eliminating differences, but in transcending them, not in winning at any cost, but in winning in a way that honored the values that made victory meaningful. The man who had stood on the heights above Hattin, contemplating the fate of his enemies, had chosen mercy over vengeance. In doing so, he had not just reclaimed Jerusalem, he had reclaimed the possibility that political power could serve moral ends, that religious conviction could inspire justice rather than brutality, and that even in the harsh realities of medieval warfare, humanity could triumph over hate. This was Saladin's true conquest, not of cities or kingdoms, but of the human heart's capacity for both power and compassion. In a world still struggling with the relationship between might and right, his legacy reminds us that the greatest victories are those that honor both the strength to prevail and the wisdom to choose mercy in the moment of triumph. Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.